Hey campers, welcome to my session for the OATK12 online symposium. My name is Mr. G. I'm an art teacher that I work out of Atlanta. I do a lot of YouTube stuff, so you've probably seen my posts on a few different Facebook pages before. Getting into my lesson, first off, I wanted to thank Dr. Harlow for inviting me to the symposium. I think this is a fantastic experience. I love us sharing knowledge. That is my thing. I love us blending together and learning new stuff each and every day. So for my lesson, I do a lot of clay. I do a lot of ceramic stuff. I was just filming some videos on one-lidded, one-throw piece vessel, doing some slip decoration on a wheel-thrown pot, and I'm kind of in the middle of a summer ceramic series that I'm working on for my channel. I thought that number one thing that I get asked by all of my new teachers, I've taught all grade levels before, but I take a lot of pride in, at my district, in my area, we have a new teacher group, and we meet once a month, and this is for new teachers to the district. The number one thing that I get asked, or that we constantly talk about, is 3D, incorporating 3D into the classroom, specifically ceramics, which that's my forte. I love ceramics. I love clay. I've got clay caked under my nails after being on the wheel for a few hours. Using the kiln is kind of one of those like high threshold of where people have a lot of concern. They don't understand the processes, the ins and outs of how a kiln works, and some people are just scared to work with a kiln, work with clay. So my class today is kind of demystifying and making kiln a lot less scary. That's my topic today. Basics of a kiln. This is a kiln. Okay, cool. Class is over. No, the kiln itself, there's a couple different variations of a kiln, and most of us work with an electric kiln, and these kilns can vary by different companies. You have Scott, L&Ls. It's Olympic. Mine's an Olympic. But you have all these different brands, but they all do the same exact thing. They cook the clay to full vitrification. If you want to know the big term of the day, the big term of the day is vitrification. Vitrification is baked the clay to its furthest cone temperature. Like I said, you have gas and you have electric. Most schools in general have an electric kiln inside of them. Reason why they have electric kilns is because an open flame is scary, and I'm on that side of the fence too. An open kiln, and just to leave it at that, I think that's a lot of variables that are questionable, especially if you have a pyromaniac ninth grader. Not a good thing. But between these two things, they still do the exact same thing. They're heating up the clay to bake it to its proper form. Doing that, you've got a gas element, which is providing an open flame to you can have an oxidization firing, and you can also have a reduction firing. An oxidization firing is where you're just cooking the clay itself within the air of the kiln. Reduction firing is where you're actually starving the kiln of air, or oxygen, and that's going to create a different result on the outside of the kiln, on the outside of the pieces. Now with an electric kiln, you only have heated elements, so basically the same as an oven in your house. If you've ever taken your oven and you switch to cleaning mode, what that does is the oven itself, the top temperature, if you got a dial, I'm old school, got a little dial on mine, goes up to 500 degrees. If you are cleaning an oven, it has that lock. The reason it's locking is because what it's doing, it's trapping the heat inside the oven to incinerate all the food particles that are inside the oven. That's heating up to about 700 to 800 degrees, depending on what manufacturer you have. The kiln is doing the exact same thing, except there's no latch to like hold it closed, and that thing's getting a lot hotter than that. But what it's doing is taking a physical and chemical change to the outside of the clay. But again, the basic difference between gas kiln and electric kiln is the type of the element, but they both do require a burn test. Now the burn test, I think, is very important, and this especially for if you've been out of your classroom for a while and you need to reaffirm that everything is working properly. Most of you won't have a gas kiln, because if you have a gas kiln, you just turn it on and see the flame. If there's a flame, it's working fine. You kick it up and the flame's going to shoot up higher, and you can use a barometer test that the kiln is heating up properly. That's the burn test that you'd use in the gas kiln. For the electric kiln, this is a lot more pyromaniac fun. What you're going to do is you're going to get small little strips of paper. So if you just have a regular sheet of notebook paper, all you're going to do is you're going to tear little strips about like so. Or if you have a sticky pad and you just want to put little sticky notes in there, you can totally do that. It does the exact same thing. What we're doing is we're putting our piece of paper in between the element and the kiln wall. You definitely want the paper touching the element. You're going to kick it on high and inspect to make sure, and you only need to leave it on for about 2 minutes max, because if it takes longer than that, then something's probably wrong with one of your coils. What we're doing is we're ensuring that each coil is heating up and charring that paper slightly to ensure that all of the elements are working properly. The reason that we're doing this is because we want to make sure that our elements are working properly, because if they're not, you're not going to reach temp inside of that kiln. And over time, these things just wear out over time and you just replace them. It's not hard to replace them. Shoot a video as soon as one of mine goes out. I will make one of those for my own channel. But the reason that we do that burn test is to ensure that everything works properly. If you get an error code, if you have a kiln sitter like I have, and also such as this, if you have a kiln sitter, then throws an error code, and sometimes you don't know what the error code is and you have to look it up, and this just makes it a little easier because you can just eliminate the things that you don't need. Now, another factor with the kilns is the venting system. So on your vents, understand how the venting system works. And why do we need to know this? You need to understand because if you have issues where you want to ensure that your firing is happening a lot smooth, you can anticipate how long that firing should go. And based upon your vent system, that is going to change what's going on. Most kilns that I've been around have an overhead venting system where you have like one of those big silver dome things that you put all over the top of the kiln. This is to be vented directly outside, and that's just a top vented kiln. It's basically just using gravity and the vent holes and any escaping element areas inside the kiln to pull, is to just let the gases free float out of the kiln, into the atmosphere. Those kinds of vents are fine. They work just fine. There's no issues with that. If the issue that I have with it is if your vent and your kiln are inside the classroom, my rule of thumb is don't fire during the school day if you can help it. I'll get into that in just a second after I go to the other vent. The other vent that you have is a down vent, where it's a box that kind of comes out of the bottom of kiln, and what that does, it's got a fan in it that is sucking all the exhaust fumes that are coming out of the kiln out of the bottom and taking it directly outside. This is kind of a two-way street. I prefer that because it forces the circulation of the heat to go around the wear a lot more evenly. The downside is that if that fan motor busts or anything, that venting system that you got is kind of kaput and you need to fix it. Also, you have elements from outside that could be going back into the kiln, and I'm kind of like leery on, I want to be able to block all of that so that debris, animals, anything like that don't come into the vent system and we got other problems to deal with, and I just don't like that. Now, getting back to your kiln is inside the classroom and it is just there, and I wouldn't fire it with anybody in the room, because when you're firing ceramics in the kiln, you have a couple things that are going on. If you're doing a bisque firing, the first firing where you're taking the clay from the raw state into the bisque form, the first firing with the biscuit firing, that's where everything turns like pinky. That's where you're going from the bone dry version to the bisqueware version that you can glaze. That sound means that it's been fired once and it's gotten all the chemical water fired out of it. And this I really put in here mainly for my students who always ask me, like, what's the difference? When you say chemical, what does that mean? That means that these bone dry ware, all the physical water has evaporated out of that. What we're doing is taking it from the bone dry side to the bisque firing. That's taking all the chemical water out of it. We're actually at a molecular level. We're taking the H2O bonds that are tied to that silica, the alumina that are inside the clay, and we're going to permanently pull those out of the clay itself, changing the physical structure of the clay. I usually use stoneware clay. If you want to get into that, I have another video that talks about all clay types, and you guys can check that out. Train of thought gone. Left the station. Now, during this firing process, you have two types of heat that are happening. You have residual heat, and then you have radiating heat. Now, the residual heat is the heat of the kiln that's happening during the firing process, and that's going to be held inside the kiln by the fire brick. This is a fire brick. Notice all the holes? Looks like Swiss cheese. Now, there's a big difference between refractory brick and kiln brick, which is, again, what this is. So kiln brick is basically a lump of clay, smash it full of sawdust, and then baked it into the kiln. All the sawdust then bakes out of it, so it has all these little porous little holes that hold on to heat really, really well. The refractory brick is a much stronger brick, and it does hold heat, but it's really for exterior builds, or what I've used it for is to prop kiln shelves up with. Make sure that you know the difference between the two, because this kiln brick is very, very, very brittle. It's almost like a balsa wood in the way that you could carve it and create it in different shapes. But this is the one that you ought to take care of, because as it's the interior of the kiln, and your coils that are inside the kiln kind of sit directly in it. You want to make sure that you don't bump it and just treat it with kid gloves. Make sure that you don't bump it, crack it, do anything that harm it. But you can use different bits of kiln wire to repair it, which isn't really hard. You just kind of shove it in and just kind of work the two pieces of metal together to bind those pieces back in place. Just be very cautious with this. And that brings us back to the radiation versus residual heat. So the radiated heat is the heat that's going to come off of the outside of the kiln. So the outside of the kiln is going to get hot. It will burn you if you touch it, but it's not as hot as the interior of the kiln. The outside of the kiln gets, a couple hundred, like about 150, 200 degrees hot. It is hot and it is dangerous. My rule of thumb is just make sure that you keep about a foot to a foot and a half of space between it and anything else, be it paper or anything that might be combustible. I keep paper in my kiln room because that's my storage room and that's where I got space. But I do keep in mind that I keep that amount of distance to ensure that there's cleanliness in the kiln room and that everything stays relatively fine. Now that brings us to loading a kiln. Now, most of us have enough kiln shelves where we can put an extra kiln shelf at the bottom, or you might have a large disc or octagon kiln shelf that you can put down at the bottom. That's going to ensure that when you fire, that you're not firing directly on the bottom of the kiln itself. You never want to fire directly on the brick itself. The reason being is because if there's glaze, if there's an explosion from a piece of bisque that had trapped air in it and it pops, you don't want anything to come into play where it's going to harm the kiln shelves, harm the bottom of the kiln. But a kiln shelf is that really strong, dense piece of it's ceramic ware, but it's really sturdy, durable, and it can take a hit. So I put everything on there and never put anything near the kiln wall, and that also includes the wall. Don't make sure your pieces are not butting up against it at all, that there is space between it. Again, taking care of the interior fire brick as much as possible. Now, on to posts and shelves. As you guys are building up, make sure that those two shelves are butted up against each other. What you're doing is when you put down your kiln shelves, make sure you have 3 to 4 feet per shelf, so everything is properly balanced out. Everything is equal weight distributed across the entire shelf. You don't want anything to be off weight, because then it'll sag, slump. That's why over time you will start to see warpage in your kiln shelves, depending on which kind you buy. And finally, post for this section. So I've got a series of different post options that we have. I've got these ones I'll show you in just a second. Stay still. Most commonly, you guys are going to have these honking kiln stilts that you guys are going to normally have, and they come in, didn't hurt. They're going to come in various sizes, and they're all kind of built the same way. 4 parts, and just Now, with kiln stilts, I never recommend stacking them unless you really have to. It is possible, you can do it, but again, don't recommend it, especially with these really thin ones. Just stacking them one on top of another, it will stay, but again, just for safety's sake and making sure that your wares don't fall and collapse, that's not what I would recommend. I do, however, have these interlocking ones. You can see plug on that side, got a hole in this side, and those pieces just kind of lock in place, and you can stack them on top of each other and they hold pretty well. If you had like one of the larger posts, we put it on top just like this to elevate the shelf just up a little bit. Again, make sure that you have enough for all the posts that you're doing on that level so that everything's balanced. And that's just going to make life a lot easier. Now, when I'm loading up my kiln, I always put a smaller, thinner layer on the bottom. So tiles, small, short little cups that only take a very small little shelf space, and then put a shelf on there so that I'm not putting a tall piece and then stacking smaller pieces up. I'm putting a small piece first and then doing taller pieces. Reason I'm doing this is because that just a little bit of rise before we put another shelf on there is giving much more stability than doing a larger expanse in between from the bottom up. That finally, on to my last part. My last part is firing and dealing with firing in general. Now, there are cone charts that you can get and hang them up in your kiln room. Your temps are done in cones. Now, what is a temperature? What is a cone? Cone is let me grab the box. A trip down memory lane for all of us. We have the Orton cone boxes. Now, Orton makes all the parametric cones of yesteryear that we would use in firing. So here we have, these are 01s. On this one, we have 04. What you need to remember about parametric cones are old school. If your kiln is an old school manual kiln, inside of it you have the parameter that kind of comes out and it has that little stilt thing. You put your cone into it, holds it right there, and then put my cone in there. As the kiln is heating and it's slowly coming up to temp, the cone pin will come down, snap that cone in half, and you'll have a nice bent cone in between. That tells the temperature of when the kiln has reached the right temperature. It melts it and cuts off the kiln. The pyrometric cones melt at a certain temperature, so each one of these is regulated to melt at a specific temperature. Cone 04 is 1945, cone 05 is 1888, and cone 06 is 1828. So it goes from 0 to 22 up to 1, and then 1 up to 10. That's the scale that you would see for most cone firings. Most of your bisque firings are going to be between that 06 to 04 range, and then your finishing firings, if you have low fire clay, it's still gonna be the same range, the 04 to 06. If you're firing anything that is going to be food based, I don't really recommend using low fire clay for that, but it's cheaper. It's cheaper to buy that clay. But if you are doing anything that is food safe, bisque fire to 04, glaze fire to 06. This makes it food safe. You always want to bisque fire 2 cones higher than your glaze firing. It's because it makes the clay more porous from the bisque, so that when the glaze fire happens, it shrinks and connects to the glaze at a better rate. This was given to me during a Mako ceramic class that I took years ago. A little bit of knowledge to impart across the boards for you guys. Make sure that, again, food safe, 2 cones higher bisque to the glaze fire. If you're doing stoneware or porcelain, you're going to fire up in the higher end, which could be anywhere between cone 6 all the way up to cone 10. If you're dealing with stoneware, if you're dealing with an earthenware is going to be in the lower range. So usually cone 3 is where most of that tops out at. And again, it all depends on the kind of clay that you have. Know that temperature or know that cone, because if you go over that, there's a reason why it says that's the max cone. The elements, the chemicals that are inside of that clay melt at a different temperature, and they will start to melt and they will turn into liquid on your kiln shelf. I thought clay would never do that. Clay can do that. You can melt it completely off, so it's completely gone. Now back to the pyrometer. The pyrometer is what tells us the temperature inside of our kiln. Most of us, if we're lucky, we have a digital kiln. That is my favorite now. I grew up and I was raised on the old school manual kiln with the 3 dials, and you had to guess at what temperature it was. The pyrometer is attached to the kiln sitter. The kiln sitter is where you set the dial to tell the kiln of how long it's going to fire, and it's gauging what the temperature is inside the kiln. If you're doing an old school manual kiln, your pyrometer is solely based upon the cones and how the cone was placed into your kiln. Now, depending on how you want to fire, you're going to put your kiln cone in there at a different angle. So what I like to do, so here are my 3 pins that are going to hold my cone in place, just like so. If I want to fire higher, I'm going to go to the thicker end of the cone so it has more mass to go through. If I want to fire it a little less, put it down on the thinner end of the cone. And what that does is, as the cone is melting in the kiln, it's going to break at a different point or bend at a different point in the melt point, and that's going to shut the kiln off. If you're dealing with old school cones, do a couple tests. Never put in a load that you think is going to work a certain way, because 99% of the time it doesn't. And take the best notes that you possibly can. When did you change the temperatures? What was the temperature outside? When was this during the year? Was the humidity level at a certain thing? There's all these little components that I go into account when I'm doing a firing in general. But if I'm doing a specialty firing, I'm doing something to test something out, I need to know all these variables. It does tend to fluctuate what's going to happen in the kiln and what the end product is going to be. A bisque fire versus a glaze fire. The big 2 things that you need to know are this. If it's a bisque fire, all the clay can stack together and touch together, and there's no issues whatsoever. If it is a glaze fire, you cannot let that stuff touch, because the glaze basically turns into glue. And what happens with glue? Things stick. And when those pieces stick together, then, well, it's a really cool assemblage piece that you just made, if all those pieces are sticking together. So make sure that doesn't happen. Once you've fired the piece, the bottoms of the piece out of the bisque fire, make sure there's no glaze on the bottom, so as it sits on the shelf, it doesn't become glued to the shelf. Best thing to help you out and make sure that that works, kiln wash. Kiln wash here is made of a couple different chemicals. One of them is alumina. The alumina is it's a chemical that doesn't burn until like cone 13. So it takes I think it's like 3,000 degrees is the melt point on alumina. Your kiln is never going to reach that. So the reason that's why we use that as a mass element inside of kiln wash is because it doesn't melt. If glaze gets stuck to it, it chips off relatively easy. Kind of flakes off. It kind of sticks to it and then like just peels off like an old sticker, which is really handy because then your kiln shelf is not damaged. Make sure that you put on a super thick coat. If you're using kiln wash for the first time, you can pre-bake them, or just run it as a bit in a bisque fire. Everything will come out. But when you paint them, give them, you know, like an hour, a couple hours to dry, so that's fully dried before you put that in the kiln, because you're having moisture content that's going to go in the air, and that becomes a little bit of a problem if you're doing a speed ramp kiln firing. Last thing there is the post firing piece. Make sure that your kiln is cool. Let it cool down completely. Typically me, I fire over a week. Why? Because I've got a digital kiln and I don't have to babysit anymore. That's like the best thing ever. Why I love having a digital kiln. Having my old school manual kiln, I would start the fire in the early morning because I had my kiln in a separate room. If your kiln is in the room, again, I said this before in the video, do not fire it while the kids are in there, while you are in there. The things that are coming out of the kiln are very, very harmful. It is not air that you want to breathe. It's basically like you chewed up a cigarette and swallowed it whole. It's just not going to do well for your body, especially when it gets into your lungs. It's the same thing as if you were firing a bisque firing, especially. Silica does leach into the air and it does get into the atmosphere. I don't want to scare you guys, but I definitely want you to be knowledgeable so that you are aware of how to fire safely. And that silica, if you look at windows, especially in an older school building where there's a kiln room, if there's windows that are on the door of the kiln room, they should have little scratches in them because the silica etches into the glass over like 10 to 20 years. So FYI, just take that into account. But again, back to the post firing, what I like to do is do it over the weekend, because my fire is usually end on Saturday night, Sunday morning. That gives it at least another 24 hours to cool down before Monday morning when I roll in. I was doing it during the school day and I was firing, and then I cooled off the night before. I do not open it for a full 24 hours. This is to ensure that the kiln has cooled down completely and I don't have any issues when I open up the kiln at all. And that's just a safety measure more than anything. There is thermal shock, which happens when you're taking the cool air from outside of the kiln and it's rushing into the kiln when you open the lid. That does become a problem, but it really only is a major problem if it's like 600-700 degrees and you open up the kiln and it whoosh of cool air. Pieces can pop. The glaze shifts really quickly because you're solidifying glass elements, and those things crack, break because it's fragile. It's a fragility thing. Wow, there's a lot of information. I just kind of rammed off fast as possible. So like I said, I do a YouTube channel and I put lots of these videos on there. I've done ceramics for a long time and I've got more videos that are like this if you want to go further deep dive. And I'm getting into a whole thing with digital drawing on a tablet because that's something I find interesting. I like to learn and I like to experience learning all the time, and I want to encourage you guys to keep that mindset going. I think this is a great community. I want to continue to see the community flourish and do everything that we possibly can together. So however else we can feed each other and provide that assistance, I'm all for 100%. So if you guys have questions, let me know. Hit me up on in an email, messenger, or in the comments below. And again, I'll see you guys on Facebook. This is a wonderful thing. I can't wait to do this again next year, hopefully. There, I'm in frame now. To see what cool things you guys have provided as well. Again, look forward to it. Have a wonderful summer, a wonderful break, get some rest, relax, kick your feet up, and have a good next school year. See you guys. Have a good one.